Alright everyone, it isn't exactly a new thing. There has been some violence in Nicaragua anyway. People are being displaced there. It looks like Ortega, who is a true socialist, is a real socialist, Sandinista, a democratic socialist, literally. You can even look on Wikipedia and they'll admit it there. He's been attacking protesters, saying, well, the opposition here that's been protesting his regime, basically saying, well, Ortega's corrupt, the last election was a farce, we want to get rid of him and restore our republic, so to speak. He's been having people killed. They have state militias in the same sense that Venezuela does. Like, you gotta understand, socialist regimes generally, they have paramilitary groups on the side of the military. The idea is that you've got a bunch of indoctrinated terrorists there, so that if your regime is ever sort of ousted in a coup and you manage to wander off into the jungle in exile, you have soldiers there, and then you can hopefully retake your thing and become a dictator again. That's because socialists know. They fear being ousted because they know that eventually the economy tends to collapse, or they tend to have to kill a lot of people, and if they're not fully successful, of course, they can end up getting killed. But this violence isn't exactly new, but it is related to socialism. The problem is socialism inevitably spawns a powerful central state. Powerful central states inevitably eventually make some catastrophic mistake in their central planning and fuck the economy, or again, there's no way for them to react to protests other than to eventually kill people if they're persistent enough. But now we have a little bit of a different scenario. The church, the clergy of Nicaragua, has finally sort of chosen a side, and they're siding with the protesters. What's the problem with that? You've got a country that's overwhelmingly engaged in Catholicism, and the Catholic clergy says, well, yeah, Ortega can't keep doing this. It's very difficult to shoot at protesters if they're being led by a priest. Then you cause outrage that goes well beyond. It's like someone who doesn't give a shit about the protests themselves sees a dead priest in front of them. That gets him pissed off because, man of God and stuff like that. But I want to make something clear, and this is the same for Nicaragua as it is in Maduro's Venezuela. One thing people need to stop doing is assuming that if they're pushing against Maduro or Ortega or something, that these groups are like, they must be right-wing movements. These are the capitalists of the country rising up and throwing off the shackles of socialism. That's not what this is about. This is about routine. In both cases, it's more about routine corruption. Maduro is seen as bad for the economy. Obviously, like the botanical gardens there in Caracas, they're like, turning into a swamp now, which is the most sad thing. As someone who really, really likes botany, almost ended up becoming a plant biologist. It's really sad to see. But when you look at these regimes, people aren't protesting socialism. They're protesting the strong man who's leading the socialist dictatorship light, which is what a democratic socialist system always is. Inevitably, because of central planning, you're also going to get a very centralized government. The executive eventually seizes more and more power. It's inevitable. There's a crisis. The legislature doesn't act in the right way. The people demand that the chief executive wield more power, and then the republic turns into an oligarchy. That's what you have in Maduro's Venezuela. That's what you have in Ortega's Nicaragua. But the protesters, by and large, are also socialists. They're just socialists that don't like the current socialist leader because they think that, in Ortega's case, violent and corrupt, cronyistic, and so forth. And in Maduro's case, economically, doesn't have a clue what he's doing. Hey, we've been starving for almost a decade now. What gives? Socialism's supposed to empower us and give us microwaves and stuff. Where's our fucking microwave? So these aren't, Maduro and Ortega both use this as a propaganda tool. They say, well, all these far-right reactionaries are trying to overthrow our glorious socialist utopia. That's just propaganda, though. Those are his fellow socialists that are simply tired of Maduro. Same with Ortega. So don't think that it's some pro-liberty reactionary movement or an uprising of capitalism within a socialist hellhole. It almost never is. Occasionally that happens. That's not the case with the protesters here. In Nicaragua, Ortega is being protested against because of his strong-arm tactics in trying to keep order, where originally you have a bunch of protests against corruption. And he sort of ignores it, and they keep growing. Eventually, he starts shooting at people, chases people off, activates the state militia and so forth, and brutalizes people. Any protests from then forth are primarily against those aggressive tactics. They're not even about the economy. Nicaragua's economy is kind of stable. Compared to contemporary nations in the region, Nicaragua actually doesn't do that bad. It's actually kind of funny. Problem is, Ortega will fall when the economy does go sliding backwards into irrelevance. It's a socialist country. It's centrally planned. Eventually it will collapse. That's just the way that the game works. Now, of course, you can have capitalist economy collapse as well, and there's not really a lot of true capitalism in Latin America, let's face it. Isn't barely any true capitalism here in the United States. What little there is primarily online. It's basically propping up the whole world's economy at this point. It's hilarious. That little kernel of capitalism keeps us alive, even if the central planners and interventionists want to constantly siphon that wealth too and make everyone miserable. Now, capitalism lifts people out of poverty. Socialism tries to keep them impoverished so that it can continue to make the argument for more socialism. It's inevitable. It's how bureaucracy works. It's the same counterpart. But here's the thing. When I look at this, I don't expect Ortega to be ousted. The size of the protests that are there are significantly smaller than Venezuela. Now, they could grow considerably. If he keeps purging people, especially if there are priests and bishops involved, that might not go over well with the mainstream Nicaraguan people. Rubio has come out and said, well, there might be a civil war now in Nicaragua. Well, again, I think that Venezuela is further along and has much more misery. The misery index in Venezuela is twice as high or some crazy amount as in Nicaragua. It's more likely you're going to get a civil war in Venezuela where people finally, they stop peacefully protesting and they honestly take up arms. In Nicaragua, apparently some of the protesters have weapons, but they're not exactly a match for the state-run militia. They've got machine guns and tanks and all that cool stuff, because in socialist countries you have to have a second military just to guarantee socialism continues. Socialism, and an idea so good you have to kill people to get others to accept it. That's how it works. But as far as Nicaragua goes, it is beginning to slide into more violence. Protests are growing again. You could have Ortega ousted. I just don't think that that's likely to happen. I think it's more likely he butchers more people. He gets condemned by the world community. Because of sanctions, his economy begins to slide backwards. More protests happen, and eventually the regime collapses. But I don't expect it to collapse with civil war. In Nicaragua, it's more likely someone takes a pot shot at him and blows his head off. Whereas in heavily disarmed Venezuela, maybe less so. You might expect other countries may have to get involved. That's about all. Peace out.